All right, everyone, I want to welcome you back. This is another video talking about a recent article published, two articles actually that I had published. So I just want to remind you that I think in the future I'm going to start doing a couple videos once in a while that are only going to be on BitChute and on Library. I would recommend you subscribe to me on Library so that when the notification goes out, you can immediately see it, whereas with BitChute, it takes a little longer, sometimes a few days even. So that's just some housekeeping stuff. Now, today we're going to talk about an article that I had published through American Greatness called Bench Warmers for Biden. So I am going to put that in the chat. And we're also going to briefly talk about first this one that I published through Anthony B. Logan's website. I'm actually his live stream is going on as I'm making this. So if you're subscribed to his channel, you definitely should check out his website. And he also has his own articles too. In any case, we'll go through this one first, and it basically goes through this slow revolution that's going on within the Democratic Party, which is something that it doesn't matter who you are, you should probably pay a little bit of attention to it. Because the fact is that the progressives are taking over portions of the Democratic Party, and they are important portions. I don't know if they'll ever take it over entirely, but you have to accept the fact that we're talking about passing of the torch here. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, many people had hope beginning in this electoral cycle, the 2020 electoral cycle, that she would be a fad, and then one of these other more moderate candidates, like I think her name was Melissa Caruso Cabrera or something. So they had hope that those people would perform the needed service of basically ending her career in Congress, right? So that is something that I feel is a little naive, because Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, while she is viewed with ridicule across the country, she has a viable public image through the media. People highlight her all the time. And I'm not going to say that people should stop paying attention to her, but they should be aware that the more you give her exposure, it's free advertising. And she is photogenic to many people. I would say she's not she is kind of pleasing to the eye. I wouldn't say that she is the knockout that some people make her out to be. And she certainly has a very irritating personality. But she's exactly the type of person that many younger, and I'm saying people between their teen years and probably their 40s, could go for, because she speaks the same type of language, and she also has the type of interests that they do. She's on Instagram a lot, and she also cares for some of the same issues: Medicare for all, the Green New Deal. So what happened a couple weeks ago is that the lady that you see here, Cori Bush, who is a candidate from St. Louis, who I don't really have, I've seen interviews with her. She doesn't seem like a bad person, but she is in virtually every manner a carbon copy of all the other members of the squad. She supports the Green New Deal, Medicare for all, and I believe free college for all. And I also think she's a BDS supporter. So she won her primary in Missouri, whatever you want to call it. I often say Missouri. So if you're from Missouri or Missouri, put in the comments which one is correct, because people say both of them. In any case, so she defeated William Lacey Clay, who was a long time, you can actually see him here. So Lacey Clay, I don't know why I didn't include a photo of him, but it doesn't matter because he's done. So he's finished. So this guy had been in office for decades. and he's done. He's finished. And one of the problems that I see with people who are analyzing this is that they're looking like this is something that was put on a couple years ago. They try to talk about, oh, his influence is growing, and all of that. Well, how has that been brought to bear for the citizens of St. Louis? It hasn't. So those of us that will judge voters who pick a more progressive candidate over an incumbent like William Lacey Clay Jr. have to realize that St. Louis is a dump, and it's partially because of failed leadership like people such as William Lacey Clay Jr. And I don't think it's going to be better necessarily because Cori Bush is going to be there, because to be honest with you, I don't believe any of her policies are winners. But she doesn't have the obnoxious demeanor that I've seen from other members of the squad from what I've seen. But that could easily change. Power changes people. AOC, you can go back and look. There are interviews of her on the Jimmy Dore show that are, and I think I'm going to make a separate video about the other topic too, but the Biden topic, so this doesn't go too long. But you can look at videos from the Jimmy Dore show when AOC was running in 2018 for Congress, and she doesn't have the same arrogance and self-image that she has now, which is just revolting, I would say. She wasn't, I would say, yes, she was a bit defiant, but she seemed like a little bit more humble. And I think that happens to people before they get elected to Congress. And I'm not just talking about progressives. You can see that certainly with the governor of my state, Mike DeWine. And that's why I think a lot of people shouldn't run for office, because most people don't have the capacity to rein in their own ego. We have a president who's very egotistical, even if you support him. And you have to be very much of a, camera slut in order to be viable for Congress. I see politicians, I've seen them in public, and they don't necessarily have the type of humility that you would want. But that's the way politics has always worked. That's the way that leadership in government has always worked. You have alpha dogs, and then you have the beta dogs, not to go full Jesse Lee Peterson on it. But in any case, so what is also important to note is that Lacey Clay had lived much of his life in Washington, D.C., because his dad had been the congressman from St. Louis, starting in 1969 and ending, I believe, it in 2001. Yep. And then Lacey Clay Jr. replaced him. And then they went on to, he's been in Congress for all these years, but there's been virtually no positive change for the people of St. Louis. So he lived most of his life in Maryland, his early years, living in Washington, D.C. with his dad. And then he also went to school in Maryland. He also started his career in Maryland. And then, he came back to St. Louis and ended up being a congressman from there. But he doesn't have, he has family ties to the city, but he's virtually he's a personality that's tied more to Washington, D.C. So this is something that people have to bear in mind when there's a sunflower seed shell in my mouth. But people have to bear that in mind, that if you're somebody who's been born to a politician, in many cases, you might not even grow up in the city that you end up representing. You end up having to discover it in adulthood, if you ever did. And really, your connection is more based on this notion that you've always been the son of a politician. And in his case, he's not even a remarkable person. He might not even be the smartest child of William Clay Sr., because he went to University of Maryland. He earned a political science degree, and then he got a paralegal certification. He never passed law school at Howard, so he's not really a sophisticated politician. And then you have to pay attention to the bigger picture here. There have always been, this is something that people have made the mistake of stating for many, many, many times. They think that there's only the squad. The squad is the left edge of the Democratic Party. And while it is true that they're generally further to the left than the rest of the party, in many respects, they are simply one faction of the far left of the Democratic Party. So to be clear, it's not just Ocasio-Cortez, Ayanna Pressley, Ilhan Omar, and Rashida Tlaib, who all, by the way, won their primaries this year. So let's dispense with this talk about, oh, there are flashes in the pan. They are there to stay, and I believe in 2022 they're also going to win their primaries because they have that name recognition. There's nothing you can do about name recognition. Okay. Um, there has always been people who are more hardline left. There's Barbara Lee of California. She's been in Congress for several years. I don't remember. I think she went in the 90s. I could be wrong. Pramila Jayapal of Washington, who is also a complete and utter Fruit Loop. If you ever watch clips of her, especially the clip of her talking to William Barr, which was I think it was just clown world levels of ridiculousness. And then there's Ro Khanna of California, who I think is a more serious progressive, but I don't agree with him on anything. And then you have people who are going to be joining them. So those are just some of the progressives in Congress. There's actually a lot of progressives. There's a progressive caucus. Jayapal and I think his name is Mark Pocan of Wisconsin both chair it, and you're going to see more of them. And there's also, I believe, Betty McCollum of Minnesota, if you want to add her in. There's plenty of other ones that don't necessarily make headlines because the faction known as the Squad, the only reason that they're called that is because they were specifically backed by the Justice Democrats in order to defeat establishment Democrat candidates in their districts. Meaning, and this is important, that they vowed that they would not take corporate cash for their campaign PACs. Okay, there are plenty of other progressives that will. So that's merely that's one element of policy rigidity that differentiates them from the other progressives. But there are plenty of progressives. In fact, I believe Jayapal and Ro Khanna also accept that, but they'd already been in Congress when the Squad got elected. So there's even less of a difference between them and the Squad. So Ocasio-Cortez unseated Joseph Crowley in 2018, and Ayanna Pressley defeated the incumbent progressive Mike Capuano in 2018. Ilhan Omar won an open seat, and so did Rashida Tlaib. And the people that they'd succeeded, Keith Ellison and John Conyers, were themselves considered progressives already. So this is not a new pattern of behavior within the Democratic Party. There are a few issues where I would say they're a little bit further away from the Democratic consensus, if the Democratic consensus even exists anymore. So you have the first things first. So Dan Lipinski of Illinois was defeated by Marie Newman, who's another Justice Democrat. Elliot Engel, who I also wrote an article about his defeat by Jamal Bowman a couple months ago for ABL. He was defeated by Jamal Bowman, and he's the chair of a committee. He's the chair of the House Select Foreign Affairs Committee, and then there's Lacey Clay. So you have two committee chairs, Elliot Engel, and I think the other one was Crowley, and those have been defeated. And you could still have, this is something I put later, you could still have people like Richard Neal who are going to be up for election next month, and they could be losing their seats. So this is not something that is just a passing phase. Okay, Richard Neal, if he loses his seat, he's the head of the House Ways and Means Committee. The House Ways and Means Committee, guess what it decides? It decides the budget proposal for the House. So whoever controls the House Ways and Means Committee, whichever party controls the budget. Now, if Richard Neal loses, the person who replaces him who's, by the way, his name would be Alex Morse. He would not inherit that committee assignment. He wouldn't, or the committee chairmanship. But Nancy Pelosi would have to dig further back in her bullpen and pick someone else, and it could be all sorts of people. It could be Maxine Waters. It could be Barbara Lee. She might have to throw a bone at one of these other progressives in order to be able to maintain her hold on the caucus. And we don't even know if Nancy Pelosi is going to be Speaker of the House if the Democrats remain in control of the House. This is something I also want to make a point about. If the Democrats lose the House, I don't anticipate Nancy Pelosi holding on. She's way too old. Jim Clyburn, I think, would end up grabbing the leadership. Um, Although there could be a struggle between him and one of the further left progressives like Jayapal or Barbara Lee, because you do have the radical edge growing within the Democratic Party. And this is something that happened in the Republican Party in 2015 when John Boehner was seen as not sufficiently fiscally, he wasn't a fiscal hawk. So John Boehner was booted as Speaker of the House in favor of Paul Ryan. You remember that? That was the Tea Party that did that. Unfortunately, it turned out that Paul Ryan was also a wobbly loser, in some ways just as bad, if not worse, than John Boehner. But that's what happened over there. The Democrats could see the same situation where whether they win the House or they lose the House, Nancy Pelosi could be simply shoved aside in favor of a more solid, hardcore progressive candidate. And that would mean certainly a move to the left of the Democratic Party. And those people thinking, oh, we can't, it's not going to happen. These things happen. Okay, that's the way it works. And it happens not necessarily because of ideological reasons. It could happen because people will say to her, "Look, your time's up. She's been majority leader, or she's been, I believe she was nominated minority leader when President Bush was still in office in 2004. And she's been in charge of the Democratic caucus either as minority leader or as Speaker of the House ever since then. So that's a fairly long tenure, and I think people ought to really deliberate about whether somebody of her age and this level of incompetence should still be Speaker, because her mind's clearly speaking. She has her mind is slipping. She's having problems speaking. So I'm kind of pot calling the kettle black there for a second, but you get the point. She has a major cognitive problem, and she's even called Trump Bush several times. I remember especially when he first got elected, she called him President Bush. Um, but the other thing that could happen is that there could be a drift to the center, because people might say, well, this has been a failure, and they could blame the radical left, and you could have a centrist drift, the way that it happened in the UK earlier this year when Corbyn stepped down from the Labour Party. He was replaced by Keir Starmer, and then it became just the Labour Party has sort of mild it out a little bit. Now there have been several attempts to unseat them. They've all been, I would say, a failure. A lot of the problem is that the people who have the biggest stake in unseating these candidates are pro-Israel super PACs. And I want people to understand this very clearly. Super PAC support will not get candidates elected anymore, because we're in the 21st century of electoral politics. And it isn't about how much ads you can buy on TV or on the internet or anything. It is a lot about, first of all, name recognition and the way the media treats you. And even with Ilhan Omar having very negative media coverage, even the hometown paper, the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, endorsing her opponent, she still easily defeated her opponent and got higher support than in 2018 in that primary. So I want people to understand this, that yes, I think that there are some positive developments if you're on the conservative side. I happen to be a little bit more on the conservative side as a libertarian. You had Laura Loomer win yesterday despite a lot of censorship on the part of the corporate media and corporations and social media companies. Those, I think, are certainly positive developments. But at the same time, I don't think that the entire American electorate is moving rightward. I think that there is this willingness to embrace the progressive fringe, and they're definitely having victories of their own, and people have to ignore this tendency to just see the positive. Okay, you have to keep your eyes on the ball. Always behave as if the fight is the fight is in full effect, and you have an opponent there who hasn't tired. You have to recognize their weaknesses, but you can't just behave as if they're completely falling apart. Even though, yes, if you look at the Democratic convention, which I haven't really been paying attention to because it sounds like a huge waste of time from what I hear about it and the few clips I've seen, I would say the Democrats are in poor shape compared to even 2016. Another thing that people need to pay attention to is that the Senate is up for grabs, and the Democrats could seize the Senate. So those of us that are conservatives have to walk into the voting booth knowing that this could be a major turning point election. If the Democrats win control of the Senate and retain control of the House and win the White House, we're in deep trouble because of the agendas of people like the two that are on the screen. You have Joe Kennedy III and Ed Markey. Ed Markey is the proponent of the Green New Deal. So if he retains his seat in this primary against Joe Kennedy, who could be the first Kennedy to lose a primary in Massachusetts since living memory, that could be a major problem for Republicans and conservatives and all sorts of people, especially gun owners. You have to remember that the Senate does have certain powers that are stronger than those of the House. You have fewer members. You have members that are elected for 6 years. They confirm justices. They confirm judges. They confirm cabinet members. This is a major, major theme that I think people should remember. So if you're in a state, and I'm not in one of them, so I can basically, I have to vote just for the presidential election and then for local and district level issues. If you're in one of these states like Montana, Arizona, Maine, and North Carolina, you are on the razor's edge, as they would say. If a Democrat gets elected, then you're basically looking at flipping the Senate. There's one Senate seat that looks like it will probably flip to the GOP, which is in Alabama, the one that was formerly held by Jeff Sessions. That's the one currently held by Doug Jones. I would say it's very likely that Tommy Tuberville will be elected there, but I think that the Democrats they're doing themselves a huge disservice the way that they're campaigning at the moment. I think that it's very possible because of first of all, with all the lockdowns and the lack of rallies and all of that, that doesn't play into the Democrats' hands because the Republicans generally, I've seen them go out and do events. I've seen them go out and gather and do all sorts of things despite lockdowns. And generally in rural areas, the lockdowns aren't very much enforced anyway, if at all. So you see this outpouring of support in some of these areas. So yeah, I would say in some of these red states where the Democrats were hoping to pick up a Senate seat, and don't be don't be under the illusion that it can't happen, but there was hope that they could take seats in Tennessee and Texas. I think that those hopes are starting to wane a bit. In fact, in Tennessee, the Democrats had their chosen candidate, the centrist named James Mackler. He was absolutely obliterated by this person nobody had ever heard of, Marquita Bradshaw. So I don't see her getting, even getting near 50%. She'll probably be just obliterated in this. Plus, her Republican opponent is well funded. He's some sort of major billionaire or something, Jim Haggerty or something. I forgot what his name is. But yeah, this is something that I think people should pay attention to. So yeah, this is called the article is called "Head for the Mountains," and you can find it on ABL's website, AnthonyBLogan.com, and I'll put it in the link. And then stay tuned for the second video, which will be about the bigger article.